Good day, ma'am. So in this video, I am going to perform the different range of motion, and the purpose of this exercise is to preserve muscle, bone, and joint flexibility. So I'll start with my head. Flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Next is lateral flexion. Next is lateral rotation. Next is in my shoulder. So, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Next is vertical abduction and vertical adduction. Vertical abduction, vertical adduction. Next is internal rotation, external rotation. Next is in my elbow. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Next is in my wrist. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Radial deviation, ulnar deviation, radial deviation, ulnar deviation. Next is in my fingers. So, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Circumduction of my thumb. And opposition in each finger. Next is in my hip and knee. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation. Next is in my ankle. Dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, circumduction. Next is in my toe. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Hello, pal. So, I am Hazel P. Cualing, and we're going to do an exercise today, ha? So, I washed my hands already before I came to your room, okay? So, we will start. We'll start in your head. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Next is lateral flexion. And then lateral rotational. Next is in your shoulder. So, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, Next is vertical abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Next is internal internal flexion, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation. So next is in your wrist. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. So, radiant deviation, ulnar deviation, radiant deviation, ulnar deviation. So, next is in your fingers. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. You will do it your all of your fingers. Next is circumduction and opposition. Next is in your knee. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Next is abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. So next is internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation. Next is dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, and circumduction. Oh my god. So next is flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, and abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, all of your fingers. And then we will repeat it on the left side. So flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. So vertical adduction, abduction, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Next is internal rotation, external rotation, rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation. Next is in your elbow. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Next is in your wrist. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. So, radiant deviation, ulnar deviation, radiant deviation, ulnar deviation. Next is in your finger. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Next is abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. Next is circumduction and opposition in each finger. Next is in your knee. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Next is abduction, adduction, abduction, 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 adduction. So next is internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation. Next is dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, dorsal flexion, plantar flexion, and next is circumduction. Your toes, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, and abduction, adduction on your fingers of your feet. So that's it, baby. So I'll go and wash my hands. So are you okay? Okay, thank you. Bye ka.